What is going on, guys? This is Earpugs, and in this video I'm going to be covering a 2v2 arena tier list for Classic Wrath of the Lich King. This tier list does assume the 3.3.5 patch, which will be the endgame balance patch. This is used by pretty much every private server out there, so Blizzard has followed the paths of private servers before with 1.1.2 in Classic and then 2.4.3 for TBC. I will be averaging all of the arena seasons together for this, so season 5, 6, 7, 8, all just one tier list. Just going to give you a blanket statement of, this is pretty good because XYZ. I will be covering at least 3 comps per class, so I make sure that no class gets left out. And without further ado, let's get started with this tier list. Up first is Ret Hunter. This comp is usually played with marksmanship, and it is a very, very powerful comp. The reasons that it's so strong is because they have Scattershot, Frost Trap, Fear, Silencing Shot, Freedom from the Pet, a physical MS effect from Aim Shot, Deterrence, Readiness, plus Dispels, and big damage. The CC chain alone from the Scattershot into Trap into Fear is very, very long, and the Hunter has tons of damage plus that Aim Shot. This is a very, very scary comp to fight against when played correctly. On top of that, the Hunter has Readiness, not only giving them 2 deterrences for extra survivability, but also the ability to double burst by resetting all the cooldowns, getting another Rapid Fire, and even getting another Trap, etc. Plus mind control from the priest if they are in a situation where they have no pressure and they're able to just chain somebody. The biggest drawback to this comp is that the hunters have a tough time with double DPS teams that can disarm, which there's a few of in Wotlk, since hunters cannot use deterrence if they are disarmed, which allows them to die fairly quickly in a lot of openers, especially against Spriest Rogue. Other than that though, this comp is absolutely insane and definitely goes into the S tier. Ret Rogue is up next. Now, this comp is still good, however, it's not as good as it was in TBC, since it does get some nerfs. For example, Fear and Blind now share a DR, so you're no longer doing those chains where you can Fear, Blind, Sap, giving you 30 seconds of guaranteed CC. This is honestly a needed change, because Spriest Rogue was absolutely bonkers for TBC. Also, Blind is now a 2-minute cooldown instead of 1.5, which is a needed change, seeing as the Rogue will now have to trade their Blind for a Trinket, whereas in TBC, if you do that trade, the Rogue will have it back 30 seconds before you have your Trinket, which is obviously not very balanced, on top of Rogues being insane. Even with these nerfs though, this comp can still demolish teams, and you will absolutely see Spriest Rogues at rank 1 on the ladder. The biggest change you'll see to the playstyle of this comp is that you'll always see the priest fearing into saps now, since the Rogue will be saving their Shadow Dance or Vanish to make sure that sap is landing. If they're able to land fear into sap, that's usually enough of a kill window to get a kill, so that is a very, very strong strategy still. A big drawback to this comp though is that Rogues are extremely squishy in Wrath of the Lich King, and this comp will get run over by some cleaves. For example, Hpala Warrior is very, very hard for Ret Rogue to deal with, seeing as you can't really fear the Warrior, and you need to get their Zerker. Not to mention the Paladin having 4 ways to break themselves out of CC with 2 sacrifices, a Trinket, and a Bubble. Even with all these changes, Priest gets some big buffs in Wrath of the Lich King, making them very good, and Rogues are still a very good class when spec'd into Subtlety. This comp lands itself a spot in the A tier. Next on the list is Discipline Priest Death Knight. Now, this comp is decent, but definitely struggles against teams that tunnel the Discipline Priest. The DK can only peel so much with Death Grip and Chains of Ice, seeing as that's all they really have to save their priest from any kind of pressure. You have no freedom for this comp, seeing as you're not playing with a Paladin, so the DK is going to be walking around a lot, and if you're fighting a Rogue team that has Crippling Poison, it's going to be a nightmare for the Death Knight because Priest cannot dispel poisons, so the DK will literally be 70% slowed the entire game. This poses a problem for this comp to get controlled a lot by certain comps. However, if they do manage to get uptime, the Discipline Priest can spam Dispel the kill target, and DKs of course do loads of damage and put huge pressure onto healers if they're able to connect to them. Since it is countered so heavily by a lot of comps, it goes into the B tier. Holy Paladin DK is up next. This comp is similar to Ret DK, except you're trading the Priest's Fear and Burns for more healing and survivability from the Paladin, along with more utility like Freedom and Blessing and Protection. This comp is stronger than Ret DK because it truly allows the DK to do whatever they want with constant dispels for not only magic but also poison and diseases, plus freedoms and the ability to bop kidneys or blinds. Not to mention the Paladin having so many different ways to break themselves out of CC with 2 sacrifices, a Trinket, and a Bubble. While this isn't the best comp in 2s, it's definitely a strong one and lands itself a spot in the A tier. Up next is Ret Paladin DK. This comp has decent survivability for a double DPS cleave thanks to anti-magic zone, self-healing from the DK, and the Paladin as well. Not to mention the fact that the Paladin has Sacred Shield, which puts a ton of damage absorption on whoever it's on. And of course, if they are both able to connect to one target, they are going to absolutely demolish it, seeing as they have Gargoyle plus Wings, Chains of Ice to make sure they don't get away, Freedoms, Dispels for themselves, plus a lot of ways to stop casts. Its only fault is that if the Paladin gets locked down, it's very hard for the DK to survive. Nevertheless, it's still a strong comp, and later on in the expansion, this comp does get pretty wild if you switch out the Ret Paladin for a Preg Paladin. If you don't know what a Preg is, I covered that in my previous tier list for Wotlk. Overall, this is a fairly solid comp and lands itself a spot in the A tier. Discipline Priest Ellie Shaman is next on the list. While Ellie Shams are absolutely bonkers in Wrath of the Lich King and the strongest caster in my opinion, they aren't super great in 2s due to their lack of spammable CC. There's only a select few comps you can run with as an Ellie Shaman in 2s, and none of them are really great, seeing as you not being able to control anything usually leads to your death pretty quickly. However, you still can play it. This comp itself has decent survivability since both classes can heal and the priest can also dispel magic. However, the only real CC they have is Hex, which is on a 45-second cooldown, and Psychic Scream, which is on a 27-second cooldown. If the Ellie Shaman is able to make space and they are able to land a CC chain, you can definitely delete people as this comp, but it is hard to do that seeing as there's so many different ways to counter fear in this game. However, Hex is very strong and usually lands on most teams. Overall though, this comp definitely goes into the C tier. Be aware though, Ellie Shamans are absolutely insane, and don't think, oh, Ellies are bad because this comp is in the C tier. It's actually the complete opposite. They are literally the best caster in the entire game for 3v3 in my opinion. They just really don't pair that well in 2s unfortunately, and therefore puts it into that tier. Up next is Enhancement Shaman Death Knight. Now, this comp is a complete win or lose in the first 30 seconds, making it very countered by Holy Paladins, which are pretty much everywhere in Wotlk 2v2, so it definitely loses a lot of points for that. However, if they are both able to connect, with the combination of Purge plus Gargoyle and Unlimited Burst with Spirit Wolves and Bloodlust, they do absolutely melt people, but do get controlled by a lot of different teams, so overall, this comp lands itself a spot into the B tier. Moving on to Disc Priest Feral. Now this comp is absolutely bonkers for Wrath of the Lich King, since Ferals get so many buffs and pair extremely well with Discipline Priests. Ferals now have Predatory Strikes, which gives them an instant cast Cyclone every time they do a 5-point finishing move, which is extremely frequent. This means that the Feral is constantly throwing out Cyclones almost every 10 seconds, on top of monstrous damage and also huge mobility since they can shift out of every slow. They also picked up a new slow, which is Infected Wounds, allowing them to actually slow the targets that they're on, making it virtually impossible to get a Feral Druid off you once they're on you. On top of that, the Priest also has Dispel Magic for not only themselves and the Feral, but also to purge targets while the Feral destroys them. And to add insult to injury, the Priest can also just spam Mana Burns and Fears as the Feral just 1v2s if they are under no pressure. To say the least, this comp is beyond strong in Wrath of the Lich King and absolutely insane. This comp lands itself a spot in the S+ tier. Next up, we have Lock Rdruid. Now, this comp can be played with both Affliction Locks and Destro Locks. However, you'll see a lot more Destro Locks running this comp since the Druid has so much extra CC to throw in. The reason Destro Locks pair so well with Rdruids is because the Destro Lock uses the Succubus pet, allowing them to CC both targets at once with fearing one and seducing the other, while the Druid gets into perfect positioning to land a CC chain, giving the Lock all the time in the world to get their Immolate and to Conflagrate off, and then of course the famous Chaos Bolt, allowing them to absolutely demolish somebody in a chain. If you waste your trinket fighting against this comp, you're pretty much dead because they will CC chain you for eternity if their pet is alive and free casting. The only drawback to this comp is that it's pretty easy to kill the pet, so once you kill the Warlock's pet, this comp definitely loses a lot of points, and it's very hard for the Warlock to now get away from the kill targets, especially if they have like a warrior on them. All in all, this comp is definitely very strong though, and lands itself a spot in the S tier. Speaking of Warlocks, we are also doing Resto Shaman Warlock next. Now this comp is really strong in Wrath, thanks to Resto Shamans getting massive buffs, along with Affliction also being very strong and pairing very well with Resto Shamans. You usually play this comp as Affliction, seeing as the Shaman provides so much utility with Grounding Totem, Hex, Wind Shear, and Purge, plus the Lock's overall insane damage on the entire enemy team. This is an extremely aggressive comp that never stops putting pressure on with full dots and purges, along with not letting the enemy healer cast thanks to Wind Shear and Spell Lock. Its only weakness is that it gets countered pretty hard by warriors, which are very common in 2v2 like Hpala Warrior, but nevertheless, if played correctly, this comp can beat any team in the game thanks to its insane kit. For that reason, Resto Shaman Warlock lands itself a spot in the S+ tier. Up next is Disc Mage. Now this comp inadvertently gets a bunch of different buffs in Wrath, seeing as they changed around the way that everybody scales and plays. For example, Warlocks no longer hyper counter mages, and you actually have a very good chance at beating Lock Druid as this comp, whereas in TBC it's the complete opposite. A huge addition that they get is of course Deep Freeze for Frost Mages, letting them lock down any target that gets caught in it and allowing them to do monster damage. When played correctly, this comp is an absolute terror in Arena thanks to very long CC chains from Fears into Polymorphs into improved Counterspell, and then even a Mind Control if they're super far ahead, not to mention the fact that they have extremely high burst damage when the Mage pops their cooldowns. Its only flaw is that the Mage is extremely squishy, and if the Mage can't cast or get any pressure going, the comp will fall apart because the Priest won't be able to save them. Even with that being said, if you are playing with a very good Mage, then they are going to be absolutely fine, since Mages have such a nice kit for getting away from other people. This comp is a very, very strong comp in Wrath of the Lich King and lands itself a spot in the S tier. Up next is Ret Paladin Disc Priest. This comp is very annoying to fight thanks to both classes being able to dispel magic. It makes landing a CC chain extremely hard and next to impossible. On top of that, both classes have heals and CC breakers, like Shadow Word Death, and then the Paladin having sacrifices as well as Bubble. They also have some pretty decent bursts with Hodge and Wings for the Retribution Paladin, making them a big threat if they're able to get your trinket and you're not prepared for it. It is a pretty decently strong comp, however there's a lot of comps that it can't deal with very well. For example, Retribution Paladin or Preg Paladin and Enhancement can just train the Priest and destroy it. Ret Paladin Death Knight can also destroy this comp if they just go on the Priest and don't get peeled. But overall, it's definitely a strong comp and lands itself a spot in the A tier. Moving on to probably one of the most unexpected comps to be very good in 2v2 Arena for Wrath of the Lich King is Retribution Paladin Enhancement Shaman. This comp is honestly insane, seeing as they have Purge, Hodge, Rep, Tremor Totem, Spirit Wolves, Dispel, Freedom, Root Breaks, Wind Shear, and also lots of self-healing. They absolutely demolish whatever target they are hitting as well, seeing as they will simply be purging them to death, allowing no hots to stick, Sacred Shield not to stick, Priest Shield not to stick, etc, etc. Even if they didn't have Purge, the Shaman still has Wind Shear every 6 seconds, making it an absolute nightmare for the healer to try to keep their teammate alive or themselves alive. This comp by itself is very, very strong, and I would put it in the bottom of the S tier. However, if this was a Season 8 tier list and you replaced the Retribution Paladin with a Preg Paladin, this comp is absolutely bonkers. Preg Enhance in Season 8 is ridiculous, seeing as Preg Paladins have unlimited healing and tons of damage, plus everything I said before that the Shaman gives them. That comp by itself would go into the S+ tier for sure. However, this is an overall tier list, and Pregs are not really a great spec until end of Wrath of the Lich King, so that's why I put it as Ret Enhance, and it goes into the S tier. Speaking of insanely strong comps, Retribution Paladin Hunter is next. This comp is so absolutely insane because they have 2 freedoms, one from the Paladin, one from the Hunter pet, along with Bop, Divine Shield, tons and tons of damage, a Mortal Strike effect from the Hunter's aim shot, which is instant, so it's landing every time, traps, rep, Hodge, silencing shot, scatter shot. Totally insane comp. So much damage and control, it is ridiculously hard to beat. Not to mention the fact that it takes a while to kill them, since they can get away from you forever with Disengage and all those freedoms and dispels, plus Sacred Shield and off healing. I can't stress how strong this comp is in 2v2, and I honestly hate fighting against it because it's such a powerful 2v2 comp. It certainly lands itself a spot in the S+ tier. Scooby-Doo Cleave is up next, which is Ret Rogue. This comp gets a lot of buffs going into Wrath of the Lich King, since Rogues now have Shadow Dance, as well as Retribution Paladins getting a whole host of buffs. This comp has all the tools to make sure that they stay on their target and don't get peeled, thanks to Freedom, plus Dispels, the Rogue's Cloak of Shadows, Shadow Step, Cheap Shot, Kidney Shot, Hodge, Gouge, etc. Totally insane kit for making sure they land their kill, plus self-healing from the Paladin and Sacred Shield. This comp is a very scary sight for any unprepared healer. The biggest problem with this comp is that the Rogue is very squishy, and if they don't generate monster pressure in their opener, then they'll usually fall over semi-quickly because the Rogue is so easy to kill, and once the Rogue gets behind, they usually can't get any pressure going. Overall though, if played correctly, this comp is a menace and lands itself a spot in the A tier. While we're on the topic of strong openers, looks like Boomkin Rogue is next. Boomkins get a whole host of buffs going into Wrath of the Lich King, like Starfall along with Typhoon. This comp's opener is also insane since they have Sap, Blind, and Cyclone, along with almost always guaranteeing they get the right opener since it's a double stealth team and they can usually position themselves into any way they want to. This comp can literally kill anybody in a few seconds thanks to rogues having huge ambush crits and boomkins having one of the highest bursts in the entire game with Starfall. Overall, it is an extremely powerful comp, however, it is also very reliant on getting a good opener. If they don't get a good opener and they start to backpedal, it's very, very hard for them to reset, seeing as neither one of them has any kind of panic defensive where they can save themselves. So that does make them struggle against a lot of teams if they can't open correctly. However, it's still a very good comp and lands itself a spot in the A tier. Moving on to Feral Rogue, this comp is very, very strong against any team that doesn't have a paladin on it, since they're able to completely delete somebody in the opener. Two things that change for this comp in Wrath of the Lich King is that Feral's off heals now are very, very nerfed compared to how they are in TBC. So in Wrath, they can't reset that much because the Feral really can't get a lot of heals going on the Rogue if they start to fall behind. And of course, with Holy Paladins and Retribution Paladins being so rampant in 2v2, fighting against those teams is always going to give you a hard time. However, the damage is absolutely unhealable if they both connect and the healer doesn't use a major defensive, and that alone puts this comp into the S tier since they have complete one-shot potential in the first few seconds. Up next is Wotlk. Now this comp gets a huge bunch of nerfs, seeing as rogues get even squishier in Wrath of the Lich King, and warlocks are no longer tanky in Wrath. On top of that, Blind and Fear both share a DR now, which is very, very difficult for this comp, seeing as they only have such a small kill window to begin with before one of them dies. With this comp, if you make a single mistake, it will likely lose you the game. While this comp is absolutely insane in TBC, it really isn't in Wrath, thanks to those factors, plus the fact that they don't have any self-healing except for bandages, health stones, and then in late game Wrath they get Bauble of True Blood, but it's not a lot of healing. And overall, this comp can be played to high rating, but it's very hard to do so in Wrath, and that blends this comp into the B tier. Now it's time for a very, very infamous comp in the WoW arena scene, and it is also time for people to get mad at me in the comment section because I'm not putting it into the S+ tier. Rogue Mage is still insane in Wrath of the Lich King, however it is not as good as it was in TBC, since silences now share a DR, making their CC chains on healers much shorter. On top of that, a lot of classes pick up a lot of defensives, allowing them to not really one-shot somebody in the opener like they can in TBC against a lot of different teams. This forces them to play on their second go a lot, and getting to a second go with both of them being as squishy as they are, while it is possible, it's definitely hard against a lot of teams, seeing as if they only take a few hits from a lot of classes, they're going to be very behind on the health department. Not to mention the fact that Holy Paladins hyper counter this comp, seeing as they have no way to deal with Divine Shield, plus all the different CC breakers that Holy Paladins have, and Holy Paladins are literally everywhere in 2s. When played correctly, this comp is of course very, very strong, and you will see Rogue Mages at rank 1, absolutely. However, it is not the powerhouse that it is in TBC. If they make a few mistakes and they get behind on health, it's pretty much over for them as long as they are not able to reset. Combining all these factors, that lands this comp a spot in the A tier. Moving on to Rogue Rdruid. Now this comp gets a decent amount of changes going into Wrath, and it's not played nearly as aggressively since Rdruids no longer have Feral Charge and also do very little damage when compared to TBC. It can still be played to high rating of course, however it's very hard to play this comp with these changes since your goes must be absolutely perfect to ensure that you actually land a kill. That's also not to mention the fact that there's a lot of mages in 2v2, and this comp has no dispel, making it very, very difficult for the rogue to generate any pressure. Combining all these factors, this comp is still good, however not what it was in TBC, and this lands itself a spot in the B tier. Speaking of changes going into Wrath of the Lich King, Shatterplay is up next, which is Shadow Priest Frost Mage. I can't stress enough how strong this comp is in 2v2. Not only do they have Psychic Scream into Polymorph into Blanket Silence into a counterspell, but they have absolutely unhealable damage if they're able to land a Deep Freeze on somebody and both of them connect to that target. To top that off, Shadow Priests now have Dispersion, Mages of course have 2 Ice Blocks, Shadow Priest off healing is still very good, since they changed spell power now to just be a flat number instead of having healing versus just DPS numbers like in TBC, and also Frost Mage is getting the ability to heal with Evocation through a glyph now. Whenever this comp gets a healer's trinket, that healer is not playing the game the next time they land a Poly or a Fear. This comp, as you can probably guess, is very, very, very good and lands itself a spot in the S+ tier, and in my opinion is one of the best 2s comps in the entire game. On the topic of Shatterpriest, we have Shatterpriest Rogue up next. Now, this is another comp that gets huge buffs going into Wrath of the Lich King thanks to the overall scaling, as well as the abilities that Shatterpriest picked up, like Psychic Horror and Dispersion. This comp's burst is almost the same as Shatterplay and can absolutely demolish people, completely 100-0 them in a cheap kidney if they're not ready for it, and has an extremely strong opener thanks to the Rogue being able to get a sap in most situations and completely destroy the other target. With the addition of Psychic Horror as well, that not only gives them a great offensive and also defensive ability to completely reset some target whenever they need to peel them, especially warriors when they blade storm, etc. Overall, Shatterpriest Rogue is an absolutely phenomenal comp and also extremely powerful in Wrath of the Lich King for 2v2. This comp lands itself a spot in the S+ tier as well. It is now time for the most infamous 2v2 combo in Wrath of the Lich King, the Mac Daddy 2's comp that has ruled the private server ladder for years. Thanks to the ridiculous amount of buffs that Holy Paladins get, and as well as warriors, Holy Paladin Warrior in 2v2 is insane, and in my opinion, probably the best 2v2 comp in the entire game. You have absolute truckloads of damage from the Warrior, not to mention the fact that they have Mortal Strike for 50% healing reduction, and if they're on a healer and they land an Overpower, they get 75% healing reduction, basically making it so they don't even need to kick the healer, they're just gonna die every time. On top of that, there's virtually no way to stop the Warrior from being a Wrecking Ball, seeing as the Holy Paladin has 4 ways to break themselves out of CC, with 2 sacrifices, a trinket, and a bubble, not to mention freedoms and dispels on the Warrior, allowing the Warrior to do literally whatever they want to whoever they're targeting. And of course, if you do manage to get through the wall of CC breaks on that Paladin, the Warrior can also Blade Storm any kind of CC, if they're able to Blade Storm before you cast it. If I said this comp was strong, I would be underselling it because it's honestly beyond insane. This comp, of course, lands itself a spot in the S+ tier. Moving on to another Warrior comp, we have Warrior Rdruid up next. This comp plays fairly similarly to how it did in TBC, except the Warrior is now more mobile with Blade Storm and the ability to charge in combat on top of Intercept. The Rdruid definitely plays more passively now than it did in TBC, since they no longer have Feral Charge and their damage is a little bit reduced. The comp is still strong, however it suffers from the same problems that it did in TBC, which is not being able to dispel any magical effects on the Warrior, thus allowing any kind of a mage team to just lock the Warrior in place for a very long portion of the game. Of course, the Warrior has Blade Storm now, which is great, but it is a fairly long cooldown, and you're going to be able to chain CC the Warrior for a large portion of the game if you're a mage fighting against this team. The Druid does help out, of course, with Roots and Cyclones, and the Warrior has tons of damage, plus the healing reductions. Overall, this comp lands itself a spot in the A tier. Moving on to Arms Warrior Retribution Paladin, this comp is absolutely able to demolish any target that they land onto. However, it is definitely a one-and-done comp. If they don't kill anybody within the first minute or so, it's pretty much guaranteed that one of them is going to be dead. With that in mind, though, definitely be aware that this comp can 100-0 any target, plus the insane healing reduction from the Warrior. The Paladin is also very hard to land a CC chain on, since they have so many ways to break CC, as well as the Warrior having Blade Storm, the Paladin giving them freedom, and then of course dispelling all the magical effects and poisons off the Warrior, giving them as much uptime as possible. This comp is another one that is pretty strong overall. It's going to go into the bottom of the A tier. However, if you were to play this comp with a Preg Paladin in Season 8 at the end of Wrath of the Lich King, that comp is very, very good, and I would probably put that in the S tier, seeing as Preg Paladins have tons of healing and damage, along with a lot of utility, of course, to help the Warrior out. If you don't know what a Preg Paladin is, definitely check out my other tier list, as I describe it in there. And last on the list, we have Arms Warrior Resto Shaman. This comp is actually not quite as good as it is in TBC, since Wind Fury gets a pretty big nerf, no longer giving you those huge smacks with the double auto attacks, which is of course a large portion of this comp's kills. However, Shamans also have Hex now, which is very good, and of course Warriors have Blade Storm, allowing them to get themselves out of CC. It doesn't have any dispels, so mage teams are going to be a bit of a problem. Luckily for the Warrior though, the Shaman can at least ground and wind shear a lot of the polymorphs that are going to be cast on the Warrior. The concept is still the same, where you run down a target, spam purge them to death, and blow all your cooldowns trying to destroy them. Combining all these things together, this comp still goes into the A tier right next to Warrior Druid. And here is the final tier list for 2v2 Arena and Wrath of the Lich King. I, of course, did not mention a bunch of comps in this 2v2 tier list, seeing as there is so many. However, I tried to cover the most common major 2v2 comps that you're going to see. This, of course, is an average of all the seasons put together, and this is where they land. I will be making another Wotlk arena tier list, which is going to be a 3v3 arena tier list, as well as making a bunch more Wrath of the Lich King content. I, of course, still cover TBC with content, so definitely keep your eyes peeled for that. So if you want to subscribe, there is a lot more to come, don't worry. And thank you very much for watching, I really do appreciate it. We will see you guys in the next video.
You